Right, so why did the fire cross the road? Because the roadside was full of phalaris. So that's a joke to get Joshua Hodges wound up, because our first speaker for this afternoon session is the very lighting up Joshua Hodges. Joshua Hodges is a fire and grassland ecologist with the CFA. They are particularly interested in how grassland species respond to different fire regimes and how grassland burning can have dual benefits for biodiversity and strategic fire management. So the very winning Joshua Hodges.
Thank you, Adrian, and thanks everyone for having me today. Yes, Josh from the CFA, just going to talk through a few things around that, and just noting that we are in the city, so I'm not necessarily sure how familiar everyone is with the Country Fire Authority, but the CFA is a volunteer-based firefighting agency that undertakes activities to mitigate, respond to and assist recovery from bushfire in the country area of Victoria. And we do a huge amount of stuff. We fight bushfires and grass fires, we respond to hazardous materials incidents, we fight structure fires and house fires, we go to rescues, and we do so much more. And we have a bit of a paramilitary structure, and we're led by a chief, but grassland burning and roadside burning is an important part, but I'll talk a bit more to that in a few moments. I'm not going to go into huge detail on the fire ecology aspects. It is my pet favourite topic, so please come talk to me about it at lunchtime. I'll be somewhere close to the sandwiches, but I do love that topic. But I'm just going to give a brief introduction to it because there's going to be more presentations on this later, and I think we've got a panel as well. But when to thinking about grassland responses to fire, you've got to think about grasslands as a competition derived ecosystem, or competition is a really important factor, and that's a result of and Steve gave a great presentation earlier on some of the productive soils. And what happens in grasslands is grass growth can accumulate up over time and choke out intertustic spaces and choke out smaller species and prevent them from establishing and flowering. And what fire does is it removes that litter and creates intertustic spaces and allows those smaller species to establish and flower. So periodic burning is a really important part of maintaining diversity in native grasslands. And in the absence, doubled up. But in the absence of frequent fire, what can happen? So you get that competition and build up over time of grass litter. But basically, and I think someone was saying before that they'd restored some grassland and some stuff had come back that they didn't think was going to be there. And what can happen is that a lot of the grasslands are resprouting dominated ecosystems, so they actually persist largely underground through buds and tubers. There are some species that persist via seed. It's very rare in native grassland, but there are some species that do come back via seed. So as that accumulation builds up, you tend to lose species from the above ground flora. They've reduced flowering, reduced space. They can still come back though if they're there in the below ground flora, and over time and long-term fire exclusion, noting that it's not always fire, there are other aspects of biomass removal too, but I'm going to focus predominantly on the fire stuff. Eventually, seed in particular gets lost quite quickly. A lot of native grasslands have transient seed banks, so they have short-lived seed. The buds get lost to ageing. How long that is a subject of great debate. For example, in some areas in the Wimmera where we've burnt native grasslands 40 plus years since the previous fire, we have had native species come back up into it, which hadn't been surveyed out there for a long time. So it's quite a long time in some areas and quite short in others. And noting too that from a CFA point of view, we're mostly focusing on roadside. So obviously there's another way that species can come back after fire, which is they can disperse in from unburnt habitat, but we're talking about highly fragmented roadside remnant grasslands, which is slightly different. All right, so CFA's interest in this. CFA brigades undertake planned burns on behalf of a land manager, predominantly shires and councils and road authorities, to reduce fire risk. These burns also have a great dual benefit for native grasslands, and they're predominantly done on roadsides and rail corridors. And there's a really fascinating history into this. It actually started, so back in the day, road reserves were predominantly used as travelling stock routes, so some of that grazing would have helped maintain native grasslands. But after World War II, just during World War II, there was a significant amount of fires in the western districts of Victoria, and a lot of the soldiers... 2 minutes left? Really? Didn't I have 17 minutes? Oh, okay. Oh, jeez. Cool. All right. Sweet. All right. Okay. I don't really know how I'm going to get through this in 2 minutes, but that's all right. Anyway, CFA does a lot of burning, protecting life, protecting townships' assets, creating landscape strategic fuel breaks of sufficient width and continuity to halt the spread of the grass fires. And how does that actually happen? Well, there's two aspects to it, a fire's spread and intensity. So grassland burning done close to assets can reduce ember attack, radiant heat, and direct flame contact onto structures. These are the three main ways that grass fires can destroy assets. So that's one way of our burning can help. There's that in photo form. Sorry, I'm just trying to whip through this reasonably quickly now.
Josh, you've got 17.
I've got 17. Oh. Whew. Reset. Reset. I've got all this nervous tension now. Oh. Okay. Whew. All right, where was I? So there's a really fascinating history to all of this. My poor little heart is pounding. I lost 60 kilos, so lucky my heart can take a bit more. But anyway, so there's a really fascinating history to all this, and that is there was a large amount of fires in the Western District, and after the war, a lot of farmers came back into the area and looked at a lot of the devastation and life loss and livestock loss and decided they wanted to do something about it. Grazing on a lot of those areas had reduced, so they started actually burning the roadsides, and they've been doing it continuously since the 1940s. And a lot of our really, really high quality native grassland out in the Western Districts is found on roadsides, predominantly in areas that have been frequently burnt by the CFA. They're not all roadsides, some of them are rail corridors. That's got a whole lot of issues associated, and we do a small amount of reserve burning and stuff like that as well. Okay, I can take this slower. Strategic priorities. So CFA, this is predominantly focused on CFA West region, which I'm representing, but we do roadside burning and fuel management for a lot of different areas. Our number one priority is always the protection of life, protection of townships and assets, creating landscape strategic fuel breaks of sufficient width and continuity to halt or slow the spread of a fire, and using fire to maintain and promote fire-responsive grasslands and ecosystems and species, grasslands being a key part of this, noting that CFA very rarely does any burning purely for ecological purposes. We do more of it now than we have in the past, but all of our burns have an ecological outcome and an ecological benefit, which is really, really important to note. We do support traditional owners in enabling cultural fire, and we do it to obviously also facilitate training and professional development. Oftentimes, for a lot of our CFA volunteers, the first time they'll be exposed to a fire is at a roadside burn, and it's really important they have that exposure to be able to see how fires behave and have that. This sounds weird, and I'm not, but often first-time volunteers at a burn will look at me and say, I didn't realise it was going to be that hot. So it's really important for CFA firefighters to be able to experience fire in a controlled, safe environment. Okay, so research shows fuel management is most effective at reducing house infrastructure structure loss when done within the wildland-urban interface, and there's three ways that fires can destroy structures: ember attack, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. When we're talking in the context of grass fires, we're mostly talking about direct flame contact and radiant heat. I do have some QR codes to some bits of research that you can look at in your own time if you're interested in this, or feel free to come talk to me at lunch or ask me questions later. So how does burning actually achieve this outcome? So in the absence of fire, we get larger flame heights, increased fire intensity, more radiant heat impacting structures, assets and people, and they're harder to suppress. And I'll talk a little bit about how we use burning to support strategic suppression in a few moments. But what the burning does is it reduces the overall biomass, reduces fire intensity, lower flame heights, less radiant heat impacting structures, assets, people, and it becomes a bit easier to suppress. This is predominantly, I don't love the term landscape strategic fuel breaks. I think it sort of sets the wrong message of what we're actually trying to achieve with these burns. But if you can imagine sort of roadsides kind of in the landscape, or rail corridors in the landscape as big long linear strips, we're burning these long linear strips so that if a fire starts in a paddock and moves into the area, we've got an area of reduced fuels to be able to suppress that fire. There's a bit of a perception out there that we do it to stop fires, so a fire starts and runs into the roadside burn and just stops. That's actually not what we do it for. It's about how do we reduce the intensity of it, reduce the rate of spread, reduce the radiant heat, reduce the flame heights, and give us a chance to be able to hold it on a roadside. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of that in a moment. But burning, and how does that actually happen? Well, burning limits spread as discontinuous grassland. So if you just bear with me for a minute, a bit of a mental exercise. So you can imagine a grassland and it's gotten a bit choked out, so it's all the you've got grass tussocks and litter all built up and everything's touching. So you can imagine a fire moving through that landscape. It just moves from fuel to fuel to fuel reasonably easily. What burning does is it reduces the litter, creates bare ground in the inter-tussock spaces, and then you've got individual tussocks kind of spread out. And for a fire to spread in that, or for a fire to spread at any great intensity, it needs to be able to actually bridge the individual grass tussocks. So it creates that discontinuous spread. So the wind speeds need to be strong enough to bridge that distance. But also noting that roadside burning is a really great way to maintain healthy native grassland, particularly of kangaroo grass. And these summer growing native grasses are greener over a fire season and act as a green break. And I'm going to give you a really good example of what that looks like from a fire that occurred a couple of months ago. But even if the winds are strong enough to push through a burnt roadside, noting that grass fires, particularly extremely devastating grass fires, some of which we've seen this year, are often very, very wind-driven and driven by very, very strong winds. If they can push through the burnt roadside, the intensity is much lower, and as I said, these make these strategic areas to suppress fires using, I made these slides probably pre-summer, so talking about tankers and aircraft, but also using machinery as well to be able to build additional containment lines associated on the other side, on the lee side of a roadside burn. So you can imagine a fire moving through a paddock. This is obviously a pasture paddock. It could be a crop stubble or anything like that, or a standing crop. Moves into the roadside, the intensity of it drops right down, and it gives us a chance for our aircraft or our tankers sitting on the road to be able to put it out before it jumps over and spreads into the adjacent paddock and continues to spread. Fire intensity in certain fires can be low enough to prevent the fire jumping the actual road with no suppression, but it's quite rare nowadays. Most of those fires get suppressed in the paddock before they make it to the road reserve. The effectiveness of this can be a bit limited at extreme to catastrophic FBIs, but just noting, I did make these slides quite a while ago. We did have our first roadside burn interact with a catastrophic grass fire this year at Natamak, and we actually had some really interesting results from that of the intensity dropping out of it when it interacted with the roadside. Unfortunately, we weren't able to pull it up on that roadside just because it happened that quickly, but it did help save a house on the lee side of that, and it did actually save quite a bit of the road infrastructure as well. So it's quite an interesting result. Even at that day was beyond catastrophic, and even under those conditions, our roadside burns are actually having a good benefit. Does this actually work? Yes. But I'll give a few examples. This is the Remlaw Road in Vectis, just west of Horsham. And these are two examples. So this was a burn done in a single day, and the roadside was cut into two the year before. One half we burnt, one half we didn't. The next year we went back and burnt the whole thing. And what we found is in the area that was burnt 12 months prior, we really couldn't get the fire to carry through there, noting that it was a particularly dry year, the year that we did it. And that was because exactly what I was talking about, that discontinuity in grass tussocks. The wind speed was not strong enough to get the fire to spread through it because grassland was that discontinuous. And it becomes that natural barrier to fire spread, which gives us some strategic advantages at higher FBIs to pull up fires on that roadside. Whereas the grassland that was burnt more than 5 years ago, that we burnt without any issue. In fact, it took very little encouragement. We put a little bit of fire into it and off it went. Very, very different, exact same set of conditions. You can see the clouds are pretty much the exact same in the photos, so I'm not fobbing you off there. That's a real thing. So, and that was purely fuel-driven differences, which I think is really, really interesting. Some examples of some ongoing monitoring that we've been doing. So obviously, when we're talking about strategic fire suppression using roadsides, we're talking about trying to increase bare ground cover to create that discontinuity in grasslands. This is some monitoring of the Joint Fuel Management Program a few years ago now, 2023, 2024. The blue is the pre-treatment, so you can see the bare ground cover was quite low, noting that this was predominantly done in a little bit further west than the volcanic plains, so quite a bit naturally bare ground in some areas. Burning definitely increases the amount of bare ground cover, and over time it stays quite discontinuous. So I believe my last sample there was 12 months later, and that was actually evident in that photo as well. So that was about 12 months later. And litter cover as well. Litter cover was quite high in a lot of the roadsides in that area at that time because burning hadn't been done for quite some time. Reducing the litter cover, so the litter is obviously a key component in grass fire intensity and rates of spread. Reducing it and keeping it quite low over an extended period of time, noting that litter reaccumulation rates are quite variable in different grasslands. It's quite a bit faster on the VVP than it is in the areas where a lot of this data came from. All right. So this is something I'm really excited about because I think it's really interesting. Obviously, the fires this year were horrible, but we did have some really interesting interactions with some roadside burning. People might have heard of this fire. This was the Mount Mercer Shelford Mount Mercer Road. Occurred in January. It started in some... I'll just explain this graph because it's reasonably complicated, but the sort of grey area is the fire. That was mapped after the fire went through. That sort of black strip down the middle is the Shelford Mount Mercer Road, which is a planned burn that got conducted in 2023 and gets conducted periodically by the local brigade. The sort of paddocks around it are various crop stubbles. So we've got oats, pasture, sorry, that one's not crop stubble, that's pasture, and wheat. So this one actually started in wheat stubble. And the green area is the Mount Mercer Nature Conservation Reserve, which is a native grassland reserve. And what happened was the fire started up in this wheat stubble, spread under a northwesterly wind, interacted with the roadside. The roadside actually helped pull it up in quite a lot of areas, so the fire stopped spreading. It did jump over in a couple of spots. It got into some trees and spotted over. And it actually, the intensity of it was quite low in the native grassland reserve, and the local brigade managed to pull it up in the reserve. The only place that it got over and kept spreading, real this time? Yep, cool. Was into some of the stubble and pasture areas. That was the bit where it got over and kept going and spreading. They held it in the native grassland reserve quite easily. Please don't take photos of this. That's why there's no photo on it. So the reason that I suspect that that's happened, and there's a lot of analysis and research being done into this now, but we talk about, and I said it at the start, about that native grasses acting as a green fire break, particularly the kangaroo grass. This was in January. The kangaroo grass was quite green at this time, and I suspect the intensity of the fire when it went through the native grasses was quite low, which allowed the firefighters to get in close and knock it down with their tankers, whereas in the stubbles and the pasture, not quite so much. They couldn't get in there and put it out, and that's where it's taken off in that corner. So that's really, really interesting, and this is probably the first... We've talked about it a lot in CFA. We haven't had any really good examples, modern examples to show it, but I think this fire really paints the picture very clearly in the importance of native grasslands and their maintenance as strategic fire breaks. There has been some research into this more broadly, not in the context of a fire being interacted with, but you can see the black dots are invaded native grasslands, the white dots are invaded grasslands, the white dots are native. You can see a lower fuel mass or lower fuel load in native grasses, which again ties into that intensity of rates of spread piece, which allows it makes us easier to suppress these fires if the rates of spread and intensity are lower, and also lower fire residence time as well, which has impacts to structure survivability and asset loss. So just in maintaining healthy native grasslands is in of itself a strategic fire risk action. And so it's all a great win-win. Native grasslands with a history of burning are high diversity, they have lower biomass and they're discontinuous. So they've got healthy native grasslands with a lot of rare species. I should have mentioned, I forgot to, but this road reserve here is home to the endemic Shelford leek orchid, which is only found on that road reserve, which is one of many examples of species only found in areas continually burnt by CFA. So very important from a conservation point of view, but they also provide us great options to be able to suppress grass fires. So great win-wins from a fire management point of view, but also a conservation and biodiversity point of view. And just very quickly, because whenever I give this presentation, someone immediately says, can't we just slash them? Fire is not necessarily interchangeable. This is what I did my doctorate on, but we do find that biomass removal can maintain native grasslands and that it can reduce competition, but eventually at some point everything needs to recruit, right? And predominantly these are seed recruiters. They persist vegetatively, but they recruit from seed, right? And at some point, recruitment needs to occur. And we find that for most native grassland species, there's a few exceptions. Most of them don't germinate very particularly well with just competition removal. They do actually need some smoke and heat cues as well, which are physiochemical conditions that only fire can provide. So it is really important to also be burning and mixing burning in the mix. Thank you. Sorry for that slightly chaotic presentation.
It's incredible, isn't that Mount Mercer story just a real eye-opener? Like, it blew my mind when Joshua told me about that the other day. Like, we've got some momentum here, and it's just great to see so much grassy action and grassy love in one place. Thank you. Big, fantastic, and that's it.